In the shadows of antiquity, there came a night when Rome nearly ceased to exist. A young city, unfortified and unprepared, stood trembling as the thunder of northern war cries echoed down the Tiber. At the River Allia, Roman legions shattered, leaving the eternal city naked before the fury of the Gauls. Flames licked her temples, despair gripped her people, and Rome's destiny seemed buried beneath ashes. Yet from ruin, a figure would rise, an exile, a warrior, a savior, whose name would forever bind Rome to survival. Witness the night Rome burned, the cry of Vae Victis echoing through history, and the exile who rose to save a dying city. Stay with us until the end. And if you stand with Rome, strike the like, share this saga, and join the legion below. Rome in the year 390 BC was still a fragile city clinging to the banks of the Tiber. Her people were hardy farmers and citizen soldiers, yet they were not the masters of Italy, nor the architects of empire. Rome was a republic still learning the weight of freedom, still untested against the storms of history. Her walls were few, her legions young, her pride enormous, but her defenses weak. This was a Rome not yet eternal, but vulnerable, more a promise of greatness than greatness itself. From the north came a menace Rome scarcely understood. The Gauls, fierce tribes swept down from the lands beyond the Apennines. Tall warriors with wild hair, their bodies painted and their weapons glinting with raw savagery. To the Romans they seemed less men than forces of nature, driven by hunger, ambition, and an unquenchable lust for plunder. These were not cautious enemies bound by treaty or custom. They were raiders who came to destroy. The alarm spread quickly through Latium. A Gallic horde was descending. Rome, bound by duty, marched to intercept them at the River Allia. Yet the day chosen for battle, July 18th, a date cursed forever in Roman memory, would become a nightmare carved into the soul of the Republic. The Roman commanders, unprepared and overconfident, arrayed their men along the riverbanks. Their lines stretched too thin, their reserves too weak, their confidence blind. Across the waters, Brennus, chieftain of the Gauls, studied the field. He was no tactician in the Roman sense, but he knew instinct and terror could shatter discipline. At his signal, the Gauls roared like thunder and charged with a ferocity Rome had never faced before. The clash was brief, violent, and catastrophic. Roman shields splintered. Their ranks buckled and panic tore through the lines. The citizen soldiers, farmers with more courage than training, were swept away in the flood of Gallic steel. Some fled toward the city, others toward the river, where many drowned in their desperation to escape. It was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The River Allia ran red with Roman blood. When news of the defeat reached the city, terror gripped every household. There were no walls strong enough to resist, no fresh army to raise, no plan to hold the gates. Families gathered their possessions in haste. Some fled to the hills, others crowded into the Capitoline Hill, hoping its steep cliffs could provide refuge. The temples of the gods, once sanctuaries of pride, became shelters of despair. Then came the Gauls. They entered Rome not as besiegers but as conquerors walking through open doors. No defense stood before them. The eternal city, though she had yet to earn that title, was theirs for the taking. The streets echoed with screams, the crackle of flames, the clamor of plunder. Statues toppled, temples burned, treasures vanished into barbarian hands. For the first time in her history, Rome lay prostrate before a foreign foe. The survivors huddled on the Capitoline, watching from above as their beloved city turned to ash. The smell of smoke choked the air. The cries of their kin pierced the night. The Romans who had believed themselves destined for greatness now faced extinction. All their myths of divine favor, of Trojan ancestry, of being chosen by the gods. What use were such tales as their city crumbled before their eyes? It seemed that Rome's story would end not with glory, but with silence. A people who had dreamed of ruling others now begged only for survival. Mothers prayed, soldiers wept, elders cursed their fate, and in the streets below, Brennus and his warriors reveled in their conquest, feasting upon the ruin of Rome. This was the nightfall of a city's soul. Rome, once proud and defiant, lay shattered, humiliated, and helpless. Few could imagine that from this darkness a new light would ever emerge. For the Romans it was the great tragedy, the wound that would never heal, a scar that would define their spirit for centuries to come. Among the ashes of Rome's humiliation, when the city seemed condemned to oblivion, there arose a man whose destiny would intertwine forever with hers. Marcus Furius Camillus. Camillus was no ordinary citizen. He was a soldier of iron discipline, a statesman of austere virtue, and a commander whose victories had once brought Rome triumph over her neighbors. Yet when the Gauls descended, Camillus was not in Rome. He had been cast into exile, condemned by the very people he had served, accused of corruption after the conquest of Veii. Betrayed by envy and political strife, he had left the city in bitterness, retreating to Ardea with his family, an outcast watching the collapse of his homeland from afar. But fate has a cruel way of testing heroes. The sack of Rome demanded salvation, and salvation required the one man strong enough to embody the Republic spirit. In exile, Camillus heard of the disaster at the Allia and the ruin of the city. The news tore through him like a blade. Though Rome had spurned him, he could not sever the bond that tied his soul to hers. Exile could strip him of his home, but not of his duty. The Romans on the Capitoline, starving and desperate, sent envoys to beg for his return. They called upon him not merely as a general, but as a father of the city. They pleaded for him to become dictator, invested with absolute power to save Rome from extinction. Camillus accepted, not with pride, but with solemn resolve. He vowed before the gods that he would rescue the Republic or perish in the attempt. Camillus's first task was not battle, but resurrection. He gathered what remnants of the army had survived, men broken in body and spirit. He restored their courage with words sharper than steel, reminding them that Rome was not yet dead. "The Gauls hold our streets," he told them, "but not our soul. As long as Romans endure, so too does Rome." Under his command, training resumed with brutal intensity. Shields were repaired, spears reforged, discipline rekindled. From the fragments of defeat, Camillus forged an army reborn. Stories spread of his resolve. To those who faltered, he reminded them of their ancestors who had stood against kings, who had driven tyrants from their land, who had sworn an oath to defend liberty. To those who doubted, he offered himself as example. An exile returned, a man humbled yet unbroken. His very presence was proof that Rome could rise again. Meanwhile, the Gauls tightened their grip on the city. On the Capitoline, famine gnawed at the defenders. The sacred geese of Juno, fed despite the hunger of men, became their guardians. One night, when the Gauls attempted a silent climb up the cliffs, the geese cried out in alarm, waking Marcus Manlius, who drove the attackers back. Yet even as such miracles heartened the besieged, despair lingered. With supplies dwindling and hope fading, the Romans negotiated with Brennus. The Gallic chieftain demanded ransom, 1,000 pounds of gold. The Romans, powerless, agreed. They brought their treasure to be weighed, but Brennus, in mocking contempt, threw his own sword onto the scales and uttered the words that would haunt Roman memory. "Vae Victis, woe to the vanquished." It was the final insult, the mark of humiliation carved into their very identity. But before the ransom could be delivered, Camillus returned. With his forces gathered and his authority restored, he marched upon the city. He entered Rome not as a supplicant, but as its avenger. Confronting Brennus, he cast aside the scales and declared that Rome would not be ransomed with gold, but redeemed with steel. "It is not with weight of metal, but with the edge of the sword that Rome shall pay her debts." The battle that followed was fierce yet decisive. Camillus's soldiers, burning with vengeance, clashed with the Gauls amid the ruins of their own homes. Each Roman stroke was driven by memory of slaughter, by rage for the insult of Brennus's words. The Gauls, weary and burdened with plunder, faltered before this renewed fury. What began as plunder turned into retreat, and retreat became slaughter. Brennus and his warriors were driven from the city, leaving behind their spoils, their dead, and their shattered pride. In the aftermath, Camillus was hailed as the second founder of Rome. Just as Romulus had raised the city from nothing, so Camillus had raised it from ruin. The people saw in him not merely a general, but a savior, a living embodiment of Rome's resilience. He refused, however, to claim kingship or tyranny. Instead, he restored the Republic, reminding Rome that her strength lay not in one man's rule, but in the spirit of her people. The exile had returned as the guardian of destiny. Through Camillus, Rome learned that even in her darkest hour, she could summon heroes to turn despair into defiance. His story became a beacon, proof that the city could fall into ashes and yet be reborn, stronger than before. For the Romans, Camillus was more than a man. He was a lesson etched into history, that no defeat, however crushing, could extinguish their will to endure. His triumph transformed tragedy into legend, and in doing so, bound his name forever to the fate of Rome. Though Camillus had driven the Gauls from the city and restored Rome's dignity, the scars of 390 BC did not vanish with victory. Rome stood breathing, but battered. Her temples lay in ruins, her houses reduced to ash, her sacred treasures stolen or defiled. The streets were littered with the blackened skeletons of homes. The smell of smoke and death lingered for months. The Capitoline had survived, but the city below was a graveyard of memory. The Romans rebuilt, yet they rebuilt with trembling hands. Every brick laid was a reminder of the night when Rome had been helpless before the fury of the North. The Republic was alive but haunted. In council, the senators debated whether the city should even remain where it stood. Some argued that Rome was cursed, that her soil had been poisoned by the blood of the Allia, that her spirit had been crushed beyond repair. They proposed abandoning the ruins altogether and relocating to Vae, the conquered Etruscan city, whose walls still stood proud and unbroken. The suggestion struck deep fear into the heart of Roman identity. To leave Rome was to deny the gods, to abandon their sacred shrines, to admit that the eternal city had no claim to eternity. Yet to stay was to dwell among ashes, with walls that had failed and a memory that burned like an open wound. The Republic wavered, not knowing whether it had the strength to endure. Camillus himself opposed the flight. He argued that Rome's greatness was not in her stones, but in her people. "We are Romans," he declared, "not because of where we dwell, but because of who we are. To abandon this place is to abandon ourselves." His words carried the weight of truth, yet even his voice could not silence the gnawing doubt that lingered after such humiliation. For humiliation had become part of Rome's very soul. The phrase Vae Victis echoed like a curse through every forum and household. Parents told their children of the day the Gauls weighed gold against swords, of the insult that burned deeper than fire. The Romans feared not only the Gauls, but the idea of Gauls, the specter of northern fury that could descend again at any time. This fear bred discipline, but it also bred paranoia. The Republic turned inward, obsessed with preventing another disaster. The army was reorganized with stricter training. Fortifications were planned and strengthened. New walls were begun, walls that would endure for centuries, massive stone ramparts encircling the city. The lessons of the sack were carved into every stone. Never again would Rome lie open to her enemies. Yet the trauma revealed cracks within the Republic. Rivalries among patricians and plebeians sharpened. The poor who had lost everything in the fires demanded relief. The wealthy whose estates could be rebuilt resisted. Some accused the Senate of cowardice for failing to prevent the disaster. Others accused the people of weakness for fleeing the field at the Allia. Unity had been shaken, and mistrust festered in the ashes. Even Camillus, the savior of Rome, was not immune to suspicion. Some feared that his authority as dictator, his triumph over the Gauls, and his reputation as second founder made him too powerful, too much like a king. Rome had expelled her kings long ago, and the memory of monarchy was still a wound. To some, Camillus looked less like a savior and more like a threat. Though he refused power beyond what was granted, his very greatness unsettled the fragile balance of the Republic. In the years that followed, Rome waged wars against her Italian neighbors. Yet in every battle, the shadow of the Gauls hung over her soldiers. Veterans of the Allia carried scars that no victory could erase. Young men grew up with stories of fire and humiliation. Even when they triumphed against Etruscans or Latins, whispers asked, What if the Gauls return? The memory of defeat became both burden and armor. It haunted Rome, but it also hardened her. No longer could she take survival for granted. Every man was reminded that the city could fall, that liberty could be crushed in a single day of carelessness. The sack of Rome became the eternal warning, vigilance above all. Yet the Republic's confidence had been fractured. Rome's allies looked upon her with new eyes. Once they had feared her growing strength, now they remembered her weakness. To the Samnites, to the Etruscans, to the tribes of Italy, Rome was not invincible. The Gauls had shown that Rome could be humbled, and this emboldened her enemies for generations to come. Thus, though the sack had ended, the crisis did not. The Republic was alive but shaken, victorious but insecure, saved but scarred. Rome was like a man who had nearly drowned, breathing once more, yet forever wary of the waters. The Gauls had burned her streets, but worse, they had burned into her soul the knowledge of her own mortality. The city that would one day conquer the world now carried within it a wound that would never close. This wound would drive her armies to greater conquests, but also haunt her dreams. For Rome had learned the terrible truth. She could fall, and that knowledge would shape her destiny forever. To understand Rome's terror, one must first understand her foe. The Gauls were not a single nation, but a tide of tribes, restless and fierce, flowing down from the northern lands where forests stretched endless and rivers cut deep into wild earth. They were Celts, tall, broad-shouldered, with pale eyes and hair the color of fire. To the Romans, they seemed giants. Their clothes were strange, their ornaments barbaric, their weapons crude but deadly. Most of all, they fought with a frenzy that seemed beyond human reason, as if the gods of chaos themselves had breathed fury into their hearts. Among them stood Brennus, the chieftain whose name would be etched forever into Roman memory. He was not a king in the Roman sense, bound by laws and councils, but a war leader chosen by strength and charisma. His warriors followed him not out of duty, but out of awe. He embodied everything the Romans feared: wild power, unchecked ambition, the will to destroy simply because destruction was possible. To the Gauls, Rome was not a sacred city or a rising power. It was prey. They had no reverence for temples, no respect for tradition, no fear of Roman gods. They came not to conquer and govern, but to raid and plunder. Their march southward was like a storm, unpredictable and merciless. Villages were burned, herds seized, captives dragged away in chains. By the time they reached the banks of the Tiber, the very earth seemed to tremble under their advance. At the River Allia, their fury erupted. They did not fight in ordered lines, with measured steps and disciplined ranks. They fought like beasts unleashed. Their horns blared, their war cries shattered Roman resolve. Painted bodies surged forward, axes and swords hacking with brutal force. To the Romans, drilled in the discipline of phalanxes, this chaos was overwhelming. They could not withstand the whirlwind. And when the Gauls broke their lines, fear itself did the rest. It was Brennus who orchestrated this terror, though he needed no intricate strategies. His genius lay in exploiting fear, in understanding that Rome's youth and pride could be broken in a single blow. He did not need to destroy their entire army. He needed only to break their spirit. In this he succeeded beyond measure. When Rome lay open, Brennus entered like a conqueror from legend. His warriors feasted in the sacred halls, laughed among the ruins of temples, mocked the people's gods. The Romans had worshipped Jupiter, Mars, and Juno. The Gauls defiled their shrines with drunken revelry. To the survivors, it was as if the heavens themselves had abandoned them. The city became a banquet for barbarians, its streets echoing with the clash of cups and the laughter of plunderers. But Brennus's triumph was more than material. It was psychological. He broke the illusion of Roman invincibility. Rome, which had stood defiant against Etruscan kings, which had proclaimed herself free and destined for greatness, now lay humbled by men the Senate called barbari. This was the nightmare, not just the loss of homes, but the revelation that Rome could be crushed, that her destiny was not guaranteed. The ransom only deepened this humiliation. Brennus demanded gold, 1,000 pounds of it, a fortune to buy back their survival. The Romans, starved and desperate, agreed. Yet when the scales tipped against them, when the Romans protested, Brennus cast his sword upon the balance and thundered the words, Vae Victis! Woe to the vanquished! It was more than a taunt. It was a law of the world as Brennus saw it. The weak do not negotiate, they obey. Those two words seared themselves into Roman consciousness. Generations would shudder at their sound. Every senator, every soldier, every child born after that day would know the shame of them. They would whisper it in times of fear and roar it in times of vengeance. Vae Victis was not merely Brennus's triumph, it was Rome's torment. The Gauls did not remain long, for their hunger for plunder outweighed their desire to rule. They departed with wagons full of gold and loot, leaving behind ruins. Yet their shadow lingered. The Romans lived thereafter with the vision of tall, wild warriors breaking their gates, with the memory of temples burning, with the echo of laughter in the forum. The Gauls became a symbol of dread, the embodiment of chaos that could descend at any time. Indeed, long after Brennus's horde vanished, the fear remained. Rome fortified her walls because of the Gauls. Rome trained her legions harder because of the Gauls. Rome carried into every campaign the determination never again to be mocked with Vae Victis. The enemy had come and gone, but in truth, Brennus had won a deeper victory. He had etched terror into Roman identity, and yet, paradoxically, this terror became the crucible of Roman power. For the Romans could not forget Brennus. They could not forgive the Gauls. Every march, every conquest, every triumph carried the echo of that shame. The specter of Brennus drove them to discipline, to vengeance, to empire. The Gauls thought they had broken Rome. In reality, they had forged her. Still, in the days immediately after the sack, none could see this. To the Romans who lived through it, Brennus was not the architect of their future greatness. He was the face of doom. His name was a curse, his people a nightmare, his cry a wound that never closed. To them, the Gauls were not merely enemies. They were a vision of what awaited if Rome ever faltered again. Thus did the figure of Brennus and his warriors stand in eternal opposition to Rome. They were the darkness against which the Republic defined its light, the chaos against which Rome forged her order, the humiliation that demanded redemption. Rome could never be the same again, for in Brennus she had seen her mirror, a reflection of destruction that threatened to swallow her whole. Amid the ashes and humiliation, Rome could have perished. Cities had been destroyed before, their names lost to time, their ruins swallowed by earth and memory. The Gauls might have made Rome another forgotten casualty of history, a smoldering corpse upon which other nations would rise. Yet Rome endured, and the reason Rome endured had a name: Marcus Furius Camillus. Camillus had already been forged in the crucible of struggle before the sack. He had conquered Veii after a 10-year war, breaking the pride of Etruria with patience and relentless determination, but jealousy and political intrigue had driven him into exile, banished by the very republic he had served. When the Gauls descended, he was living in Ardea, a bitter man stripped of honors. Yet fate, which had humbled Rome, summoned him back. The people, desperate for salvation, begged him to assume the dictatorship, granting him absolute authority to rescue the republic. Camillus did not hesitate. Though wronged, he placed Rome above grievance. His heart beat not for vengeance against his enemies in the Senate, but for the city itself. He swore an oath before the gods: if Rome still breathes, she will not die while Camillus lives. His task was monumental. He inherited not a city, but ruins, not an army, but fragments. The survivors of Allia were broken men, their courage drowned in the Tiber alongside their comrades. Families grieved, temples lay desecrated, gold had been stolen. Even the Senate debated abandoning Rome altogether, fleeing to Veii where strong walls might protect them. It was in this moment, more than any battlefield, that Camillus proved his greatness. Standing before the people, he denounced despair. Shall we abandon the soil where our ancestors lie? Shall we forsake the altars of our gods, the hearths of our fathers, the promise of our children? No, we shall not flee. We shall rebuild. We shall rise greater than before. His words rekindled a fire the Gauls had tried to extinguish. Camillus organized the reconstruction with the same discipline he brought to war. The ruins of houses became stones for new walls. Temples were rededicated, sacrifices offered, and prayers lifted to the gods. Most of all, Camillus set his focus on defense. The city would not remain naked again. Massive fortifications were planned and built. The Servian walls, towering ramparts of stone that encircled Rome and declared to the world, never again. But his vision extended beyond stone. Camillus reshaped the army itself. No longer would Rome rely solely on levies of farmers hastily called to arms. Training became rigorous, discipline merciless, command absolute. He forged the survivors of Allia into hardened soldiers, instilling in them the lesson that courage must be married to order. The shame of defeat became fuel for an army unlike any other in Italy. To the young men of Rome, he gave not only weapons, but purpose. Remember the night of fire, he told them. Remember the cry of Vae Victis. Let it be carved into your hearts. Let it burn in your blood. Never again shall Rome kneel. Never again shall she pay ransom for her life. You are the guardians of her destiny. His words spread like sacred law, binding generations to a vow of vigilance. Camillus also understood that Rome could not live in fear alone. She must act, not merely react. Thus he turned Rome outward once more. The city resumed her campaigns in Latium, reclaiming allies and subduing rivals. Each victory rebuilt confidence. Each conquest washed away the taste of humiliation. Rome would not only survive the Gauls, she would use the memory of them as a whetstone to sharpen her sword. In time, Camillus faced the Gauls again. When they returned in smaller bands to raid Latium, he marched out and crushed them. These victories were not merely military, they were symbolic exorcisms, proof that Rome's nightmare could be confronted and destroyed. Each Gallic corpse upon the field was an answer to Brennus's taunt, a denial of Vae Victis. But Camillus's true genius was not only in rebuilding walls or armies, it was in reshaping the Roman soul. He transformed despair into resolve, shame into ambition, ruin into renewal. The sack of Rome had been a tragedy, but under Camillus it became a catalyst. The Romans no longer saw themselves as vulnerable farmers by the Tiber. They saw themselves as a people chosen by fate to endure, to resist, to rise from ashes stronger than fire could consume. Thus was born the Roman doctrine of resilience. No defeat, however crushing, could destroy them. No enemy, however fierce, could erase them. So long as Romans lived, Rome would rise again. This belief, planted by Camillus, would carry them through the centuries, from the Punic Wars to the struggles with Macedon, from the deserts of Africa to the forests of Gaul itself. When Camillus finally died, he was mourned not as a man, but as a second Romulus, the father who had saved the city a second time. He left no throne, no dynasty, no crown. Instead, he left something far greater, a Rome that knew she could survive destruction, and in surviving, conquer destiny. The Gauls had sought to break Rome. Instead, through Camillus, they had unwittingly made her unbreakable. The exile returned as savior. The city rose from ruin, and humiliation was transmuted into iron. Rome had found in Camillus the leader of her rebirth, the guardian of her eternal flame. From this point forward, every Roman carried within him the memory of fire and the vow of renewal. The sack of Rome had nearly ended history. Camillus had ensured it would only begin. The Gauls had come and gone, leaving Rome scarred, humiliated, and nearly destroyed. Yet from those ruins rose a spirit stronger than walls, sharper than swords, more enduring than gold. Rome was reborn. The sack of 390 BC did not end her story, it ignited it. In the years that followed, the Romans carried the memory of Allia and the ashes of their city like a sacred burden. The phrase Vae Victis was etched into every heart, a warning and a vow. Never again would Rome allow herself to be defenseless, unprepared, or divided. The Servian walls rose as stone guardians, vast ramparts that circled the city like a clenched fist. Where once wooden huts had burned, marble and brick began to stand. From ruin came renewal, and with renewal, ambition. The Romans did not merely rebuild, they transformed. The army that had scattered at Allia became a machine of discipline. Camillus's reforms ensured that no soldier was merely a farmer with a spear. Each man was forged into part of a greater whole. Phalanxes gave way to maniples, flexible and deadly, able to adapt to any terrain, any enemy. Rome was no longer a city-state vulnerable to sudden storms. She was becoming an engine of conquest. The first to feel this reborn fire were the neighboring tribes of Latium and Etruria. Where once they had mocked Rome's weakness, now they tasted the steel of her resolve. Campaign after campaign, Rome asserted herself. Defiance was crushed, alliances secured, enemies humbled. The city that had nearly been erased began to draw others into her orbit. But the memory of the Gauls was never forgotten. When smaller bands of them returned to raid Italy, Rome met them with unflinching fury. Under Camillus and his successors, the Romans pursued them not with fear, but with vengeance. The ghosts of Allia were laid to rest with every Gallic body that fell beneath Roman blades. Rome declared to the world and to herself that no barbarian terror would ever again dictate her fate. This transformation was not only military but spiritual. The Romans came to believe they were chosen by destiny, protected by their gods, tested by disaster to prove their worth. Other cities might crumble under such catastrophe. Rome had risen greater than before. This belief became the cornerstone of Roman identity. Resilience through trial, strength through suffering, glory through endurance. And from this crucible emerged a Rome unlike any the world had seen before. She was no longer the frightened city by the Tiber. She was the wolf reborn, her fangs sharpened, her hunger insatiable. The humiliation of Allia became the fuel of empire, driving Rome to expand, conquer, and dominate. Generations later, when Roman legions faced Carthage, Macedon, or Parthia, they carried within them the lesson of the sack. When disaster struck, whether at Cannae or Carrhae, they remembered Camillus, remembered the fire, remembered the oath. Rome endures, Rome rises, Rome never dies. Thus, the sack of Rome became more than a tragedy. It became a myth of survival. Children grew up hearing of the night their city burned and of the leader who had restored it. Senators invoked the story as proof of Roman greatness, generals as proof of Roman resilience. The Gauls had thought they ended a city, but in truth, they had forged an empire. As the centuries passed, the memory of Brennus and his sack lived on, not as a wound, but as a warning. The Romans would build an empire upon vigilance, never allowing weakness to invite destruction. The walls of Rome stood as stone testimony, the legions as flesh testimony, the will of her people as eternal testimony. Rome had been humiliated, but humiliation had been transformed into power. The ashes of 390 BC became the soil in which empire was planted. The fire that had devoured huts now burned in Roman hearts, an unquenchable flame. From ruin, Rome rose, not only restored, but destined. For in that hour of despair, when survival seemed impossible, Rome had chosen not death, but defiance. And from that choice came the seed of immortality. Cities fall, empires crumble, but Rome had discovered the secret of eternity, to rise again and again and again. The Gauls had left their mark upon the city, but Rome had turned that scar into armor. What was once shame became strength. What was once terror became triumph. From the embers of defeat, the wolf of Rome howled louder than ever, announcing to history that she would not only live, she would rule. And so the story of Rome's sack does not end in ashes. It ends in resurrection. From humiliation rose ambition. From ruin rose empire. Rome, once nearly destroyed, now marched toward her destiny. Not as a victim of history, but as its master.